You're tuned to Radio Kidnappers, the voice of Hawke's Bay. This is a program called Real Wealth, hosted by the team from the Stewart Group in Hastings. It's our pleasure today to have in the hot seat Glen Trillo from the Stewart Group. How are you going, Glen?
Very well, thanks, Ken.
Good to have you here with us. Now today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of, say, investing in property, bricks and mortar.
Sure.
But before we get there, just remind our listeners, the Stewart Group, what do you guys do?
Yeah, so we're financial planners, or goals-based financial planning. So we look at what your goals and objectives are and build a financial plan to help our clients achieve those goals. And that also includes KiwiSaver and also risk insurance as well.
Yeah. And where are you?
We're at 204 Carrama Road in Hastings.
Now, we're going to talk about property. What's property? Everyone loves property, don't they? Everyone loves bricks and mortar.
Everybody loves property.
Yeah. And why does everyone love property?
Well, it's an obsession with New Zealanders, isn't it?
It is.
In particular with New Zealanders. We're a bit of an outlier from many countries. That's not to say that other countries don't love property as well. But what's the reason? I think one of the key reasons is there is a lack of knowledge amongst New Zealanders on alternative investments. And because of that lack of knowledge, you hark back to Black Tuesday, 1987. Yes. Wasn't just New Zealand, but their share market crash. And a lot of people were stung by that. And this is intergenerational. It gets passed down, those bad experiences, to their children. And that has resonated. Also, of course, there's some tax advantages or historic tax advantages on having rental property as an investment. We're, I think, the only country in the OECD where you can actually write off offset cost against personal income. So there's a tax advantage, or negative gearing, is another way of putting it. Something which I think the tax working group will look at, but more on that shortly. So there's been advantages in owning property for people.
Now, of course, we've talked many times over the last couple of years, and you were all about diversification. You don't like the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. But before you came out, I did a bit of research, and I've got 12 pros and cons of investing in property, and I just thought we might like to go through each of the pros to start off with.
Sure.
And the number one is that it's a stable investment.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the last handful of years, there's been an investment that's been giving some considerable capital gains to people, to many people. Having said that, if we looked at the property boom where much of this more recent phenomenon has started from, the peak of it was in 2007. And if I look locally here in the Hawke's Bay, between 2007 and 2013, thereabouts, no gain in property values.
No.
And in fact, in some places of the Hawke's Bay, the property values had actually dipped a little bit in price. So, we had a good 6 years or thereabouts of no gain at all. So it doesn't always go up. I hark back even further, of course, during the decade of the 1970s and the early part of the 70s, it went up 40-odd%.
Yeah, huge.
By 1980, it went back to about what it was back in 1970, so we had a significant collapse in property prices.
Now, when we talk to, in particular you guys from the Stewart Group, when we talk about, say, buying shares, it's always buy the shares with long-term investment in mind. They don't expect to make a killing overnight.
Yep.
And, hold on for at least 7 years and they're probably going to work out for you. Is that the same attitude we should have when we're looking at property, that it's a long-term investment, or is it different from shares?
It should be considered a long-term investment. The thing about property I think we need to understand is, yes, there is some capital gain to be made, and people have made capital gain. You can also see a capital loss, all right? But it is an expensive asset to sell when you need to, or when you come to quit your property investment. It takes time to sell. Then the average sale time is between 4 and 6 weeks, that's depending on market conditions, and it's expensive. If you've got a $500,000 house, you're going to be spending in the late teens in order to sell that property. So it takes time, it's expensive, it's not liquid. An investment portfolio, you should be able to get funds out within 4 to 5 working days.
Yeah. People don't look at that side of it though, do they?
No, they don't. And for many people, they don't really consider it when they go into buying property.
No.
The other thing they also often don't consider is the yield on property. So we're seeing investment property being snapped up with very low rental returns or yield, if you will, okay, comparable to what they have to pay for it and pay on their mortgage and outgoings. So it then becomes speculation as a speculative investment because they're looking for capital gains. Because you certainly wouldn't do it for rental return because the yields are often so very low. So they are looking or they are chasing capital gain on property. So it's speculation, really.
Yeah. The second pro of buying a house or investing in property is you can leverage an investment. That's true, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it's true. And the banks will lend. It has come back on rental properties. They've lowered what they call LVR or lending value ratio, and that's directed by the Reserve Bank. But you can borrow on property. You can borrow on shares as well, leverage equity or leveraging on equities, but much more popular in property.
Is it easier to borrow against property than it is against shares?
It is because the banks actually take a mortgage or security over the title on your property. And it's sort of bread and butter investment, really, or borrowings for banks. However, if the property market goes the other way and there's a retraction or there's a fall in prices, that exasperates the loss in value that you will suffer because you have many people gear up to the max on the property value as much as they can. They will leverage heavily, and if there's a fall, you can end up in negative equity.
They've been talking about a property bubble for probably at least the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, saying this bubble's going to burst, but it doesn't look like it, does it?
No, and we've had very strong migration into New Zealand. None more so than Auckland, arguably. And what I think we're seeing from Auckland now is a lot of Auckland investors, property investors, are looking outside of Auckland and seeing quite attractive opportunities in other parts of the country. So that's driving up the region property prices as well. So that's fine at the moment. With that said, so what can impact that? If the immigration reverses, because it hasn't always been like this. If I look back at the 2008 election where National won power, John Key from Helen Clark Labour government, you look back at the old advertising for that campaign, and a lot of that was to do reversing the brain drain from New Zealand to Australia and bringing back those New Zealanders from Australia to New Zealand. Well, for one reason or another, we've achieved that, but it has now gone the other way, whereby we have a tremendous amount of people coming into New Zealand, but that can reverse.
Yeah.
And if that does reverse, and there's not the same demand, it's supply and demand, isn't it?
Of course.
So you can see a fall in property value. The other thing, though, which probably concerns me slightly more, we have really low interest rates at the moment. Okay, so the interest rates, and I've been saying this for a while now, the interest rates are not normal, what we're seeing here at the moment. You know, fixed interest rates of 4.25%, that's not normal. And if interest rates were to double and go back to 8 or 9%, which I would argue is probably the historic norm, what impact is that going to have on property prices?
Well, that's right. It's going to put some people right in the doggy duties, isn't it?
Well, it will do. And if property values drop, you may end up in negative equity.
Yep.
But it's just people's day-to-day living being able to pay for a much increased mortgage cost. So it's just something to be aware of. It's not all, gold glitter, if you will.
No, it isn't. But if you were going to speculate, Glen, when might you suggest that those interest rates will move? I mean, you're in the financial business.
Yep.
Do you hear whispers, or is it just part of a trend that will happen, then it'll go back again down the track?
It's cyclical, isn't it? Or cyclical. Similarly, so is property prices.
Sure.
So at some stage, interest rates will go up. Now, I don't believe that they're going to go up in the next 12 months, 18 months, but there could be a shock that causes that to happen. But at some stage, I think when you're buying a property, and I'm fairly sure banks are pretty good at doing this, despite what the media says, when they assess a home loan application, they base it on probably more like 8.5% interest, as opposed to your 4.5% interest.
Yeah.
Allowing for a person's ability to pay more. But if you've leveraged up to the hilt and things you're just getting by now, just be prepared at some stage you could be paying a lot more.
Sure thing. Okay, number 3 on the list of the pros about buying a house, and by the way, there's 7 cons in the list I've got, so it's not all peaches and cream. Number 3, it can generate positive cash flow for you. And it can.
Yeah, it can do. It can do. I mean, if you have the sort of equity in the property, quite a substantial amount of equity, so therefore your borrowings are not that high, and or you may own it outright, then it just becomes a bit of a cash cow, because that rental return, less some fixed costs, maintenance, rates and insurance, the difference is then yours to spend and do what you want with, or to achieve your goals. So absolutely it can, provide a positive return to you.
Yeah. Now, you've already briefly touched on property can offer you tax benefits, particularly in New Zealand. So we're going to number 5, and that is the long-term investment of property does give you huge financial freedom down the track. And I mean, you're just a young fella. Imagine if you had a couple of properties you're using as rentals. You get to 65, you say, I'm selling up. You've got a couple of $1 million probably in the bank.
Sure. Property long term, if you pay it off over the 20 odd years and you have good stable tenants, can be a great form of investment. And I'm certainly not against residential property as a form of investment. And certainly when you go into retirement, whether it's a rental property or a owner-occupied property, you'd want to be mortgage free. Okay, you don't want to be having to pay a mortgage whilst only really getting national super and maybe a bit of KiwiSaver top up or something. So in an ideal world, you'll be mortgage free in retirement, and if you have some extra assets like a property that you can sell, that's great, and it will certainly help you. But there's also alternatives to property as well. I look at the New Zealand share market. Since 2012, the returns has been between 9% and 24% per annum.
That's good, isn't it?
Okay, it's good. And in fact, four of those years have actually been between 13.5% and 24%. So whereas property has performed well, so has the share market. And I find some people have quite a blinkered view about, well, it's all about property and there can't be anything else.
Yep.
There is an alternative, and the alternative has been performing well.
Before we get on to the cons, I'd also like to suggest to you that maybe the main reason is that people are in love with property is you can look at it.
Absolutely.
You can touch it.
Yes.
You can update it. It's there.
It's there.
You don't have to think, I've got a bit of paper.
Yeah.
It's a share. What's a share?
It's a number on a page, isn't it?
So do you think that's part of the fixation, that we can actually physically go and look at it and we say, that's my place?
Absolutely. And I understand that. You can see it, you can touch it, you can drive by it, and that's never going to go away. So
dead right. Exactly. Now, the number 1 con, apparently, of investing in property, and you touched on it, but it might get you to explain a bit more to our listeners, it's not very liquid. What does that mean?
What that means is if you need to sell it, it will take, depending on market conditions, 4, 5, 6 weeks to sell, maybe more. It also means that unless you can borrow against it, you can't take money out of it. So to realise the value, to realise the funds, you have to sell it. Apart from the time frame, it will cost, I think, say 4% cost to sell plus legal fees. So it's costly to sell, it takes time, and so that's a main consideration, whereas,
Although having said that, I went house shopping in the weekend with a friend of mine who's looking at downsizing, and the unit that she looked at had 6 offers on it.
Yep.
Now, you say it's, it might take a long time to sell, but it is cyclical, that market, and at the moment, they're selling like that.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, pretty good market to sell on at the moment, isn't it?
Good market to sell on at the moment. Yeah, very much so. But I reflect when I sold property 3.5, 4 years ago in Napier South. That sat on the market for almost 4 months. So once again, it's a cyclical nature.
Sure.
When we sold last time, or time before last, it took almost 6 months to sell it. So
I guess also the other thing, if you're buying a house as an investment, you don't want to buy a house that is going to put you under financial pressure if you have to sell. So if you're sitting on it, takes 4 months, you don't want to be personally bleeding while you're selling it, do you?
No, and unfortunately, if you're in a position whereby things aren't going well and you're almost forced to sell, Murphy's Law will be, it may well be at a time when the property market is in the doldrums, so it could take longer, so therefore you have to reduce your price expectation, which means you get a lower price. Just something to consider.
Yeah. Now, we spoke off air about one of the cons of maybe investing in property, and that can be that there can be hidden problems associated with a property. So, you come across your dream home, you say, we're in love with this house, we want it, we're buying it.
Yep.
What are some of the things that can go wrong?
When we spoke, we sort of we also discussed different ways of buying a property.
Yep.
So, whether it's we look at tender or auction, you're under pressure as a buyer to make the offer as clean as you possibly can, to put your best foot forward. So if you put in conditions like a builder's report, a LIM report, search of title, P testing, for example, these are all conditions that may detract from your offer, because the vendor or the owner is looking at it saying, well, yeah, but another one's is basically a cash sale. But if you don't do the reports, you could buy a property with some inherent issues. Now, all property require maintenance, whatever age it is, and you accept that if you buy a 1920s property, that will have more ongoing maintenance than a new build. But I and many people listening to this, we're not property experts, we're not builders, and it doesn't take much of a concern to start talking some big money.
It is big money, absolutely.
And even if you get a property which is in a very good state of repair, it may have had alterations done. Let's say it's had a load-bearing wall taken out. They made the living room area bigger into the kitchen. They've taken out a load-bearing wall. They put up a bracing up top. But if there's no council sign-off, that's on you as a purchaser if you buy that property.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is a big problem.
It's a problem, be expensive to rectify, and in some cases a council will just say, well, we're not going to issue you compliance, and will actually instruct or force you to actually make good the repairs, and that means structural changes. Even if there's nothing actually wrong with what was done, they can't see in behind the walls.
No.
So they're going to get you to pull out the wall linings, and then it starts from there.
Retrospective permits don't really exist anymore, do they?
No. You can get a call different things a letter of acceptance from a council, but that's a costly exercise.
Yeah. Okay, now another, and this is probably the main reason that people might not be getting into property at this stage, is property has a high entry cost, particularly at this time.
Yeah, it does. The Reserve Bank has been working hard for some time now to ensure that people have a larger deposit, particularly on rental properties. Okay, so whereas before you could go up to 95% on your property that you live in and also on a rental, but now it's a much higher deposit into a rental property. Okay, so the requirements for a deposit has certainly increased, which I think is a good thing. But having said that, property prices, I've noticed in Wellington, Auckland, the main centres, they haven't really increased for over the last 12 months.
No.
They're pretty stagnant. I see one of the main trading banks recently have come out and said, look, over the next 4 years, we actually expect property prices to fall across New Zealand to some degree, because we can't keep seeing this year-on-year growth. The other thing I'm noticing, certainly locally in the Hawke's Bay, is more and more properties being listed with a price guide, or the good old-fashioned put a price and chew the fat, as opposed to auctions and tenders, which sort of suggests to me that I think there's a bit more realism coming back into the market.
Yeah, and that is a good thing, I guess. Also, and we've touched on it, that the number 4 on my list of cons, and that is changes. For instance, tenants moving out, you've got to get a new tenant. They say you really got to look at your repayments and write off 6 weeks' rent every year,
Correct.
just in case tenants don't leave. That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and I think you're pretty naive as a landlord if you go into the rental property purchase and you believe that you're going to get 52 weeks a year of rent. It seldom happens that way, and so 6 weeks seems to be the agreed number of weeks that you should accept that you won't be getting a rental return. because when a tenant moves out, you'll often do a bit of a clean-up of varying degrees, and by the time you advertise, get it re-tenanted, you'd have to be writing off 6 weeks a year.
Yeah. Now, this is the big one, and you talk about it all the time. Diversification. You shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket. I might suggest to you, though, that the Joe Blow listening to this is going to say, oh, I'd rather have a house any day.
Yeah, and I understand that, because once again, they can touch it, they can see it, they can feel it. What I would say is I'm not against rental property as an investment. Okay, I've owned rental properties in the past. I will do so in the future. What I'm not in favour of is the rental property as being the be-all and end-all of your investments, that you should diversify. So if you're a landlord, instead of building up a property empire, maybe you should take some of that excess cash or capital and put into other investments, be it shares, be it fixed interest or bonds and what have you, because there's a return on that investment as well. Is diversification. The issue if you have too much of your assets in one type of investment, if that goes sour, and at some stage the property values will track in a different direction, you don't want all your monies tied up in that. Okay.
I wonder, though, what you're saying does make sense, and I'm reading it off this bit of paper, it does make sense.
Yep.
But diversification can be very expensive, can't it? Because if you're mum and dad investors, and you might be, say, borrowing against your family home because you've got a lot of equity in it, for you to buy a house, for instance, as a rental, and then you're saying, well, diversify because you don't want all your eggs in one basket, let's get some shares as well. We're talking a lot of money, aren't we?
No, I mean you can commence if we take KiwiSaver, and it may just be KiwiSaver, for example. So you can start off with KiwiSaver basically at a zero balance, and so certainly if you don't have a lot of if you don't have your $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 to invest, but if you don't have KiwiSaver, you should commence KiwiSaver, and it only requires $1,042 per year to get the members' tax credits from the government, or $521. So you should have something else to the side. And for those people with additional funds that are thinking about, do I purchase a further rental property, or should I be looking at diversifying and putting it into a share portfolio, for example, come and speak to us, because there is an alternative. And certainly shares and fixed interest have been, the market has been kind to investors over the last few years.
Yep.
And there's another alternative as well.
Too right. Just about out of time now. We've already covered number 6 and number 7 on our list. And number 6 was bad tenants. They can be a nightmare because not only can they disappear owing you rent, but they can wreck your house as well.
Yeah, they can. And there's some very sad stories out there. You see them on the news every now and again, fair go and what have you, and there's not a lot of help for the landlords. Tenancy tribunal can only do so much.
Yep.
If the tenants have disappeared, then there's not a lot of chance of getting your money back, and an expensive exercise to reinstate the property.
Too right.
And loss of rent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the time it takes to do it.
And you mentioned that dreadful word P. Imagine.
Yeah. And I know that recently the scientific advice of the government's come out and said P is actually not quite the issue that we were led to believe. But having said that, if you're actually producing it and cooking it, then I think there's still a concern there.
And if you were buying it and someone said, oh yeah, look, it did have a user of P in here, and we have got the certificate, you'd immediately think, not my cup of tea, sorry.
Well, some people will say that, and that can detract from the value.
Too right. Yep. Glenn, just remind our listeners, want to come and see you at the Stewart Group. Where are you?
We're at 204 Carrimer Road in Hastings.
As always, our pleasure. You look after yourself. We'll talk to you same time, same place next time.
Great. Thanks again.